The most dangerous assumption people can make is believing your kindness means they have already made your decision for you. That thought stayed quietly with me as I sat in my late husband's favorite chair, watching family members gather in the living room after the memorial service. The house felt strangely full and painfully empty at the same time. Fresh flowers covered nearly every table. Framed photographs of my husband filled the mantel above the fireplace, and the familiar scent of coffee drifted through the kitchen where we had shared thousands of ordinary mornings together during 48 years of marriage. Friends had gradually gone home. Distant relatives had offered their final embraces, and only the people closest to me remained. My son David stood near the large front window speaking softly with his wife, Lauren. They exchanged a quick glance before walking toward me together, each carrying the careful confidence of people who believed they were about to do something thoughtful. Lauren sat beside me with a warm smile and gently placed her hand over mine. "Evelyn," she said kindly, "David and I have been talking for weeks about how we can make life easier for you after everything that has happened." I smiled politely and listened. David pulled a dining chair closer before sitting directly across from me. "Mom, we know this house carries wonderful memories, but it is also a lot for one person to manage. The yard, the maintenance, the repairs. Dad always handled those things." His voice remained gentle, never demanding. Lauren nodded in agreement. "We found a beautiful condominium only 15 minutes away. It has security, an elevator, wonderful neighbors, and almost no maintenance. You would never have to worry about mowing the lawn or climbing stairs again." She reached into a leather folder resting beside the sofa and removed several glossy brochures filled with photographs of bright modern apartments overlooking a quiet park. Everything had clearly been researched with great care. They had already compared prices, studied floor plans, and even highlighted units they believed I would like best. Looking through the pages, I realized they had spent many evenings preparing this surprise. They truly believed they were helping me. "If you decide to sell the house," David continued, "we can make the transition completely stress-free. We would handle everything. You would not have to worry about contractors, paperwork, or moving." Lauren smiled warmly. "We just want you to enjoy life instead of carrying responsibilities alone." Their kindness was genuine. I never questioned that. Yet as they spoke, something inside me quietly noticed what had disappeared from the conversation. No one had asked whether I wanted to leave my home. They had carefully solved a problem before asking whether I believed one existed. I looked around the living room where every photograph, every piece of furniture, and every worn corner held memories Harold and I had built together. This house was never simply wood and brick. It was 48 years of birthdays, family dinners, Christmas mornings, quiet evenings, and promises kept. I closed the brochure and smiled softly. "Thank you," I said. "I can see how much thought both of you put into this." Relief immediately appeared on their faces. Lauren squeezed my hand gently, while David smiled with quiet satisfaction, both believing gratitude naturally meant agreement. Neither of them noticed that I had thanked them only for their effort, not for the decision they had already imagined I would make. As their conversation continued about moving schedules and future possibilities, my thoughts quietly drifted backward exactly 2 days earlier when my telephone rang unexpectedly. The familiar voice on the other end belonged to James Whitmore, my husband's attorney, and before the conversation ended, he spoke a sentence that would change everything I believed I understood about the future Harold had quietly prepared for me. 2 days before the memorial service, the house was so quiet that I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway marking every passing second. For nearly 48 years, Harold had filled those silent spaces with simple sounds that became part of everyday life. The rustle of a newspaper at breakfast, the soft humming while he worked in the garage, the familiar footsteps crossing the hardwood floor each evening after watering the roses in the backyard. Losing him did not only leave an empty chair at the dinner table. It changed the rhythm of the entire house. That Tuesday afternoon, I stood in the kitchen making tea when the telephone rang. I almost ignored it, assuming another neighbor was calling to offer condolences, but something urged me to answer. "Mrs. Harper," the calm voice said, "this is James Whitmore." I immediately recognized Harold's attorney. James had handled our legal matters for more than 20 years and had become one of the few professionals Harold trusted without hesitation. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he continued gently. There is something your husband specifically instructed me to place in your hands, but only when I believed the appropriate time had arrived. I leaned against the kitchen counter, surprised. Harold left additional instructions? James paused before answering. Yes, he was very specific. He wanted this delivered privately, and only after you had enough time to begin thinking beyond the first days of grief. Would you be willing to meet me tomorrow afternoon at my office? I looked through the kitchen window, toward the backyard where Harold's roses were beginning to bloom despite everything that had happened. He always believed flowers kept their promises regardless of the season. I will be there, I answered quietly. The following afternoon I drove into downtown Chicago beneath clear spring skies. James welcomed me into his office with the same quiet professionalism Harold had always admired. Instead of leading me into the larger conference room, he escorted me into a smaller private office overlooking the Chicago River. A single cream-colored envelope rested on the polished walnut desk. Before I even sat down, I recognized Harold's handwriting across the front. My name had been written exactly the way he had addressed every anniversary card, every birthday letter, and every Christmas gift during our marriage. James remained standing for a moment before taking the chair across from me. Harold prepared this nearly a year ago, he explained. He instructed me not to release it immediately after his passing. He wanted you to receive it only when family conversations naturally began shifting from grief toward decisions. Those words immediately caught my attention. Did Harold expect disagreements? I asked softly. James smiled kindly and slowly shook his head. No, Harold never predicted conflict. He simply understood that people who love one another sometimes begin solving problems before asking the person most affected what they truly want. He wanted to make certain your own voice would always remain the strongest one in the room. I looked down at the envelope resting quietly between us. It seemed impossible that something so ordinary could suddenly feel so significant. Carefully lifting it into my hands, I noticed Harold had sealed it himself. The edges were slightly worn, as though it had patiently waited for this exact afternoon. My fingertips rested on the folded paper while memories of our final year together slowly returned. Harold spending evenings inside his study reviewing files. Harold smiling whenever I asked whether he was working too hard. Harold reassuring me that he simply wanted everything organized so I would never feel overwhelmed one day. At the time, I believed he was organizing financial records. Sitting across from James, I realized he had quietly been preparing something much more valuable. As I gently opened the envelope and unfolded the first handwritten page, I understood that my husband had left behind one final conversation, and every word was about to change the way I looked at the future waiting beyond my grief. My hands rested quietly on Harold's letter as I took a slow breath before reading the first line. James remained respectfully silent across the desk, giving me all the time I needed. Beyond the large office windows, afternoon sunlight reflected gently across the Chicago River while the city continued its ordinary rhythm. People hurried along the sidewalks, traffic moved steadily through the streets, and life carried on exactly as it always had. Inside that quiet office, however, time seemed to pause. The familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Evelyn, the letter began. If you are reading this, then you have already survived the hardest goodbye either of us ever imagined. Before you make another important decision, I need you to remember something you have forgotten during these difficult months. You have always been stronger than you believe. I smiled through quiet tears because those words sounded exactly like Harold. Throughout our marriage, he never tried to solve every problem for me. Instead, he reminded me that I already possessed the wisdom to solve them myself. I continued reading. Harold never mentioned David. He never mentioned Lauren. He never warned me about any specific person or predicted conflict within the family. Instead, he wrote about grief itself. He explained that after losing someone you love deeply, the world suddenly becomes filled with people eager to help. Their intentions are often kind, but kindness sometimes arrives carrying assumptions instead of questions. One sentence immediately settled into my heart. Never mistake another person's confidence for your own certainty. I slowly lowered the letter while James quietly opened a leather portfolio resting beside him. Inside were several neatly organized legal documents bearing Harold's signature, each prepared nearly a year before his passing. James carefully arranged them across the desk before speaking. Your husband revised several provisions within his estate plan, he explained calmly. These amendments do not reduce anyone's inheritance, remove anyone from the family, or change Harold's long-term wishes. Their purpose is remarkably simple. I looked up. What purpose? James smiled gently. To protect your ability to choose. He slowly guided me through each document in plain language. Harold had established that every significant decision involving the family home, any future sale, relocation, or major financial change remained entirely my decision until I personally decided otherwise. No deadline could pressure me. No recommendation could replace my judgment. No one else could authorize permanent changes on my behalf. Every important choice belonged completely to me. I listened carefully while James answered each question with patience and clarity. Nothing about the paperwork felt dramatic or complicated. There were no hidden surprises, no elaborate legal traps, and no attempt to punish anyone. Harold had simply protected something he believed grief often weakens if left unguarded. My confidence. Did Harold think I would need this? I finally asked. James folded his hands together before answering thoughtfully. Harold believed love sometimes causes people to move too quickly. He trusted your family completely, but he also trusted you. He wanted to make certain that no amount of concern, urgency, or good intention would ever become more powerful than your own voice. Those words reminded me of countless evenings during our marriage when Harold patiently listened before offering advice. He always believed listening was the greatest form of respect. Suddenly, every late night he spent organizing papers inside his study took on new meaning. He had not been preparing for conflict. He had been protecting my independence. James carefully slid Harold's handwritten letter back toward me. Take this home, he said warmly. Read it as many times as you need before the memorial gathering. Harold wanted you to remember who you were before everyone else began telling you what would be best. I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside my handbag beside the estate documents. As I stood to leave the office, I realized Harold had not left me a plan for what decisions to make. He had left me something infinitely more valuable. He had quietly made certain that every decision would still belong to me. Driving home from James Whitmore's office, I replayed Harold's letter over and over in my mind. Every sentence carried the same quiet wisdom that had guided our marriage for nearly 5 decades. He had never tried to predict the future. Instead, he had prepared me to meet it with confidence. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the afternoon sun rested low above the maple trees lining our street, casting long golden shadows across the front lawn Harold had cared for every weekend without fail. I sat in the car for several minutes before walking inside, still holding the envelope in my hands. The house welcomed me with its familiar silence. Harold's reading glasses remained on the small table beside his favorite chair. His gardening hat still hung on the hook near the back door. Every room reminded me that grief never arrives all at once. It quietly introduces itself through ordinary moments. As I slowly walked through the living room, memories from the previous several months began returning with surprising clarity. They were not dramatic memories. No one had argued. No one had spoken harshly. Yet I suddenly noticed a pattern I had completely overlooked while grieving. It began only a few weeks after Harold became seriously ill. Lauren volunteered to organize appointments because she believed it would reduce my stress. I appreciated her kindness. Then she started coordinating repairs around the house after a storm damaged part of the fence. Again, I felt grateful because I had little energy to think about contractors. Later she began comparing retirement communities, saying she wanted us to understand every option before we ever needed one. I listened politely, assuming the conversations were simply practical discussions. Little by little, those conversations became decisions already taking shape before I had even formed my own opinion. David rarely questioned the process. He trusted Lauren because she was organized, thoughtful, and genuinely cared about our family. Whenever she suggested something, he usually smiled and agreed. Looking back, I realized neither of them intended to ignore me. They simply believed they were making life easier during the most difficult season I had ever experienced. Unfortunately, kindness without careful listening can quietly become something entirely different. One Saturday afternoon, nearly 3 months earlier, Lauren had arrived carrying several folders filled with information about downsizing. She spread brochures across my dining room table while describing maintenance-free living, fitness centers, walking paths, and secure buildings designed for older adults. She smiled warmly throughout the conversation, pointing out beautiful kitchens and comfortable living rooms that she believed matched my taste perfectly. I remember thanking her for spending so much time researching everything. At the time, I believed we were only exchanging ideas. Now, remembering the hopeful excitement in her voice, I realized she had already begun imagining my future inside one of those buildings. Another memory followed immediately afterward. David had measured the garage and quietly asked whether Harold's woodworking equipment should be donated once everything settled down. I answered that we could think about it later. He nodded kindly, but I now recognized that he had assumed later meant deciding when, not deciding whether. None of those moments seemed important by themselves. Together, however, they formed a picture I had never fully seen until reading Harold's letter. My family loved me deeply. That had never changed. What changed was that grief slowly encouraged everyone to become problem solvers instead of listeners. Sitting alone in Harold's favorite chair that evening, I unfolded his handwritten letter once again and reread the sentence that had stayed with me since leaving James's office. The people who love you most may someday become so determined to protect you that they forget you are still perfectly capable of protecting your own voice. As darkness slowly settled outside the windows, I finally understood that the days ahead would not require arguments or confrontation. They would simply require me to remember the woman Harold had always believed I already was. The morning of the memorial service arrived beneath a bright blue Chicago sky that seemed almost unfairly beautiful. As I stood in the kitchen arranging fresh flowers Harold had always loved, I realized how easily ordinary routines could steady a grieving heart. Preparing coffee, setting plates on the dining table, and opening the curtains one by one gave my hands something familiar to do while my thoughts remained fixed on the letter safely tucked inside my bedroom drawer. Harold's words had quietly changed the way I looked at every conversation that unfolded around me. Shortly after the service ended, family members gathered inside the house, sharing memories that brought both laughter and tears. Harold had been the kind of man who made everyone feel welcome, and the stories reflected exactly that. His former co-workers remembered his patience. Our neighbors recalled how he never refused to help repair a fence or shovel snow from a driveway. Watching everyone celebrate his life reminded me that true character leaves behind far more than possessions. As the afternoon continued, many guests gradually said their goodbyes until only David and Lauren remained. Lauren carried 2 mugs of tea into the living room before sitting beside me with the same warm smile she always wore whenever she believed she had found the perfect solution to a problem. David settled into the chair opposite us. "Mom," he said gently, "Lauren and I have been talking again about the next few months." I simply nodded, encouraging him to continue. Lauren unfolded several neatly organized pages from a folder resting on the coffee table. "We spent the last few weeks researching everything carefully," she explained. "There is no rush, of course, but we wanted you to know that we have already contacted a wonderful real estate agent, a moving company, and even a professional organizer who specializes in helping families transition into smaller homes." Her voice remained filled with sincere enthusiasm. Every recommendation came from genuine concern. "We even found a beautiful condominium with a lovely courtyard," she continued. "It is close to restaurants, your church, your favorite grocery store, and only 10 minutes from our house. You would never have to worry about home maintenance again." David smiled proudly. Lauren thought of every detail. I looked through the neatly prepared information without interrupting. Every page reflected hours of careful planning. Estimated selling prices for my house had already been highlighted. Monthly expenses for the condominium had been compared with current maintenance costs. A tentative moving timeline had even been written across the final page. I noticed one detail that quietly caught my attention. Every sentence described what would happen after I moved. None of them asked whether I wanted to move at all. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back onto the coffee table. "Both of you have clearly worked very hard," I said with genuine appreciation. Lauren's face immediately brightened. David exchanged a satisfied glance with her, silently believing my gratitude confirmed everything they had hoped to hear. Neither of them realized I had carefully answered only the effort they invested, not the conclusion they had already reached. For the next half hour, the conversation continued naturally. Lauren spoke about decorating ideas for the condominium, nearby walking trails, and how much simpler daily life would become. David discussed practical matters like home inspections and market conditions. I listened patiently, asking occasional questions without revealing what I already knew. There was no reason to interrupt them because Harold had taught me something remarkably important inside that handwritten letter. Sometimes people discover the truth more clearly when they are allowed to finish the story they have already written in their own minds. As evening approached and they gathered their folders before heading home, Lauren smiled warmly and said, "I hope you know we only want what is best for you." I smiled just as warmly. I never doubted that for a single moment. After they drove away, I quietly looked toward the calendar hanging beside the kitchen doorway. Tomorrow afternoon our family would meet at James Whitmore's office, and one unopened leather portfolio was patiently waiting to remind every one of us that love should never replace another person's right to choose. The following afternoon, I arrived at James Whitmore's office several minutes before our scheduled meeting. The modern building overlooked downtown Chicago, its glass walls reflecting a clear spring sky that seemed almost too peaceful for the emotions quietly waiting inside. James welcomed me with a reassuring smile before leading me into the large conference room where Harold and I had signed countless legal documents over the years. Everything looked familiar. The polished walnut table stretched across the center of the room. Comfortable leather chairs surrounded it, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. A pitcher of water, several crystal glasses, and neatly arranged folders rested in front of each chair. Only one item immediately caught my attention. Beside James sat the same dark leather portfolio I had seen during our private meeting the day before. It remained closed. I quietly took my seat without saying a word. A few minutes later, David and Lauren entered together. Lauren smiled warmly as she greeted both James and me before sitting beside David across the table. They appeared relaxed, almost relieved that this final meeting had finally arrived. David loosened his tie and looked toward me with gentle concern. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked kindly. "I am doing well," I answered with a small smile. "Thank you for asking." Lauren reached across the table and lightly touched my hand. "After today, everything will become much simpler. We can finally start helping you settle into the next chapter of your life." Her voice remained sincere. There was no arrogance or impatience. She truly believed she was offering comfort. James waited until everyone had settled before opening the first folder. "Thank you all for coming," he began in his calm, professional manner. "Today we will review Harold Harper's estate documents together and confirm that everyone understands the current structure of the estate." The meeting unfolded exactly as I expected. James carefully reviewed bank accounts, insurance policies, investment records, charitable donations, and several routine legal documents. Every explanation was clear and methodical. David occasionally nodded while Lauren quietly made small notes on a legal pad she had brought with her. From time to time, they exchanged brief smiles, each one reflecting the quiet confidence of people who believed everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. I listened carefully without interrupting. Harold's letter remained fresh in my memory, reminding me that patience often reveals more than argument ever could. Nearly 40 minutes passed before James closed the final routine folder. David smiled politely. "That all seems very straightforward," he said. Lauren glanced toward the stack of completed paperwork before asking, "Is there anything else we need to review before the signatures?" James looked toward her with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the meeting. "There is one final matter," he replied. "It involves documents Harold instructed me to keep confidential until this meeting." Lauren blinked with mild surprise. "Additional documents?" she asked. James nodded once. "Yes." Without another word, he slowly reached toward the unopened leather portfolio resting beside him. The room became noticeably quieter. Even the steady sounds of city traffic beyond the windows seemed to fade into the background. I watched David straighten slightly in his chair, while Lauren's attention remained fixed on the portfolio. Neither of them appeared worried. Instead, they looked curious, assuming another routine explanation would soon follow. James carefully opened the portfolio and removed a neatly organized collection of certified legal papers together with a familiar cream-colored envelope bearing Harold's unmistakable handwriting. My name appeared across the front exactly as it had the previous afternoon. James placed both items gently onto the polished table without speaking. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows, illuminating Harold's signature across the top page with remarkable clarity. No one said a word. For several long seconds, every expectation that had quietly filled the room seemed to pause beside that unopened letter, waiting for the truth Harold had carefully protected until this very moment. No one spoke as James rested his hands gently on the leather portfolio. The quiet inside the conference room seemed almost intentional, as though Harold himself had asked every one of us to slow down before taking another step. James carefully unfolded the cream-colored envelope and removed the handwritten letter I had already read the previous afternoon. He looked toward me first. I gave him a small nod, silently giving permission to continue. Harold instructed that this letter could be shared with the family during today's meeting. James explained calmly. David leaned forward with quiet curiosity while Lauren folded her hands together on the polished table, still appearing completely relaxed. James began reading aloud. Harold's words filled the room with the same calm kindness that had shaped our family for decades. He spoke about gratitude, responsibility, and love, but most importantly, he spoke about freedom. He explained that losing a spouse often encourages loving family members to step forward with good intentions. Yet even the kindest intentions should never replace the voice of the person still living the life being discussed. Every sentence felt gentle rather than corrective. Harold never criticized anyone. He never accused anyone of selfishness. Instead, he simply reminded us that dignity grows strongest when people are invited to choose for themselves. When James finished reading the letter, he quietly placed it beside the remaining legal documents before opening the final folder. Along with this letter, he said, Harold authorized several amendments to his estate plan approximately 11 months ago. David looked surprised but remained calm. Lauren tilted her head slightly, waiting for the explanation. James continued, These amendments do not alter the financial inheritance of any beneficiary. They do not remove anyone from the estate, and they do not change Harold's desire for this family to remain united. Their only purpose is to protect Mrs. Harper's independent authority regarding every major decision involving the family residence and related assets. David frowned slightly. What exactly does that mean? James answered with quiet precision. It means no recommendation, family agreement, future timetable, or proposed plan can become effective unless Mrs. Harper personally decides that it reflects her own wishes. Harold wanted every significant decision to remain entirely hers for as long as she desired. Lauren looked toward me, her confident smile slowly fading into thoughtful silence. I thought. She began softly before stopping herself. James continued without interruption. Harold believed Mrs. Harper should never feel pressured by love, urgency, or convenience. He believed advice should always remain advice, never expectation. The room became remarkably still. I looked toward David and recognized something changing behind his eyes. He was not angry. He simply appeared to be reconsidering conversations we had shared over the previous months. Lauren lowered her gaze toward the documents resting on the table. For the first time since the meeting began, she seemed less interested in paperwork and more interested in understanding what Harold had truly intended. After several quiet moments, David finally spoke. Dad never mentioned any of this. James smiled gently. He hoped he would never need to. His greatest wish was that Mrs. Harper would always feel completely free to make her own choices without legal protections becoming necessary. These documents simply ensured that his confidence in her judgment would remain protected regardless of future circumstances. I slowly looked around the conference room. Sunlight continued pouring through the tall windows, illuminating Harold's signature across the final page. Nothing dramatic had happened. No voices had been raised. No accusations had been exchanged. Yet the atmosphere inside the room had completely changed. The future everyone believed had already been decided was quietly returning to the one person Harold believed should always decide it. As James carefully slid a fountain pen toward my side of the table, every pair of eyes naturally turned toward me, waiting to discover what decision I would make now that the truth finally belonged to everyone. The conference room remained perfectly still after James finished explaining Harold's final amendments. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass walls, but inside that quiet room it felt as though time itself had paused. Every document rested neatly on the polished walnut table, and the elegant fountain pen James had placed in front of me seemed to carry far more meaning than a simple signature ever could. I looked down at Harold's familiar handwriting one more time before slowly lifting my eyes toward David. My son did not appear defensive. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost as though he had suddenly begun replaying months of conversations from an entirely different perspective. Lauren remained unusually quiet beside him. The confidence that had accompanied her into the meeting had not disappeared because she felt defeated. It had disappeared because she had finally seen something she had never intended to overlook. After several long moments, Lauren spoke first. Her voice was soft and completely sincere. "Evelyn," she said gently, "I truly believed we were making things easier for you." I smiled kindly because I never doubted her intentions. "I know," I answered. "That was never the problem." She looked at me with genuine confusion. "Then what was?" I rested my hands calmly on the table before speaking. Somewhere along the way, everyone became so focused on protecting me that no one stopped to ask what I wanted to protect for myself. No one interrupted. Even James remained completely silent, allowing our family conversation to continue naturally. David slowly nodded as though those words explained something he had been struggling to understand ever since Harold's letter had been read aloud. "I thought we were helping," he admitted quietly. "You were," I answered gently. "But there is an important difference between helping someone and quietly deciding what their future should become." The room remained peaceful. There was no anger in my voice because anger had never been my purpose. Harold had not prepared those documents so I could prove anyone wrong. He prepared them so I would never feel pressured to surrender my own judgment simply because everyone else believed they already knew the answer. I slowly picked up the fountain pen. David and Lauren naturally watched my hand, believing I was about to sign the waiting documents. I held the pen for only a few seconds before gently placing it back onto the polished table exactly where James had left it. The quiet gesture carried more meaning than any dramatic speech ever could. "I will not be signing anything today," I said calmly. Neither David nor Lauren argued. Neither looked disappointed. Instead, both simply listened. "This does not mean I reject your love," I continued. "It means I accept Harold's final gift." He reminded me that gratitude should never require giving away my right to choose. James gave a small, respectful nod before speaking for the first time in several minutes. "Mrs. Harper is under no obligation to make any decision today," he explained. "Harold specifically designed these amendments so that time would never become a source of pressure." David slowly leaned back in his chair and released a quiet breath. "I think I understand now," he said softly. "We kept asking how to make your life easier, without first asking how you wanted to live it." His words settled gently across the room. Lauren looked toward me with moist eyes filled not with embarrassment, but with honest reflection. "I am sorry that I confused planning with listening," she whispered. I reached across the table and lightly touched her hand. "There is nothing wrong with wanting to help someone you love," I said warmly. "The only mistake is forgetting that love begins by asking instead of assuming." James quietly gathered the unsigned papers into the leather portfolio, while afternoon sunlight continued filling the conference room with a peaceful glow. No one had received the gratitude they quietly expected when the meeting began. Instead, every one of us received something far more valuable. We were reminded that respect always comes before appreciation, and that the strongest families are built not by making decisions for one another, but by protecting each person's freedom to make them for themselves. Several months passed, and the conversation that had taken place inside James Whitmore's conference room slowly became something our family no longer remembered with discomfort. Instead, it became the quiet turning point that allowed each of us to understand one another more honestly. Summer arrived in Chicago with bright mornings and warm evenings, and life gradually returned to familiar routines. Every Saturday, I carried my coffee onto the back porch just as Harold and I had done for years, watching sunlight spread across the roses he had planted with his own hands. The house no longer felt like a place everyone expected me to leave. It felt like home again because the decision had finally become mine instead of everyone else's. David continued visiting nearly every weekend, but something about those visits had changed in the most meaningful way. He no longer arrived carrying folders, schedules, or carefully prepared plans. Instead, he usually stopped at the neighborhood bakery and brought fresh cinnamon rolls or blueberry muffins before sitting beside me on the porch. We spent hours talking about ordinary things. Sometimes we laughed about Harold's endless collection of woodworking tools that somehow never seemed to stay organized. Other afternoons, we remembered family vacations, old holiday traditions, and stories David had nearly forgotten from childhood. Those conversations slowly reminded both of us that healing rarely comes from solving the future. It grows naturally when people finally learn to be fully present with one another again. Lauren changed in quiet ways that touched me even more deeply because they happened without anyone asking her to change. The first time she visited after our meeting with James, she stood beside the kitchen counter before saying something I will always remember. "Evelyn," she asked with a gentle smile, "what would you like to do with the garden this year?" It was such a simple question, yet I immediately recognized the difference. She was no longer presenting a completed plan. She was inviting my opinion before making one. We spent the afternoon planting fresh flowers together exactly where Harold and I had always planted them. She asked questions instead of making assumptions. Sometimes I accepted her suggestions. Other times I preferred my own ideas. Neither choice created disappointment because respect had quietly replaced expectation. Early that autumn, James invited me back to his office one final time to review my own estate plan. We organized everything carefully so that one day my wishes would remain just as clear for David as Harold's had been for me. Before I left, James walked with me toward the elevator and smiled warmly. "Harold trusted legal documents to protect your choices," he said. "But he trusted your character to protect your family." Those words stayed with me throughout the drive home beneath streets lined with brilliant autumn leaves. That evening, I carried Harold's handwritten letter into the backyard garden just before sunset. The maple tree he planted during our 10th wedding anniversary cast long shadows across the lawn, while a gentle breeze moved quietly through the branches. I unfolded the letter one final time and reread the closing sentence that had changed everything for me. "Never allow gratitude to become the price of surrendering your own voice." I smiled softly before folding the letter with the same care Harold had used when writing it. Then I placed it inside the wooden memory box beside our wedding photographs, anniversary cards, and decades of handwritten notes we had exchanged throughout our marriage. Looking toward the house glowing beneath the warm evening sky, I finally understood the greatest surprise Harold had left behind. It was never hidden inside legal documents or protected by signatures. The true gift was the quiet confidence to remember that love becomes strongest when it honors another person's freedom to choose. Our family never needed perfect agreement to move forward together. We only needed enough wisdom to understand that respect always comes before gratitude, and that listening will always build a stronger home than deciding for someone else ever could. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.